You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pamela Kreiser, and this semester I'm teaching NCR 507, which is Research Design and Interpretation. This class is basically about how we conduct research on a basic level and then what we do with the results. Now, sometimes when I tell people that I teach this class, they aren't sure what it really entails. They aren't sure what it is that we're looking at. And so, of course, in this opening section, we want to talk about the basics of research design and interpretation. So what we'll basically cover in this class is quantitative methods, and we'll also cover program evaluation, or how we do some qualitative analysis. Now, one of the things that you might be thinking is, what happens when we think about something like quantitative methods? Usually when I bring that up to somebody and say I teach quantitative methods, they say, oh, I'm not really into math, or I don't really like the numbers. So as we talk about quantitative methods, I find a lot of people have a negative reaction. But what we're going to find out today is that it's not really about the numbers. The numbers just help us make comparisons, looking for differences and relationships. And so in this session, we're going to kind of differentiate some of the basic parts of measurement as we explore three main areas. One is the basics of data measurement. Second is, why do we measure something? And then third, what do we do with the results? Now let's start with the basics of measurement. One question is, how do we measure something? Of course, a key question would be, do you want to capture the data that you're collecting in words, or do you want to capture it in numbers? That's the distinction between qualitative and quantitative measurement. So in other words, when I cast a net out in any kind of research project and I capture words, then I'm doing qualitative data. And when I capture measurement in any area and get numbers, then I'm talking about quantitative measurement. So really, to talk about those kinds of differences is to say, are we talking about collecting words, or are we talking about collecting numbers? And then what, in fact, do we do with those results? So let's take a look at the decision-making process that a researcher has to go through in order to conduct a study. When you decide you want to examine a certain variable, the decision about what methodological approach to use is best informed from a theoretical framework. In other words, your decision about how to collect data should originate with what you believe that you want to know or investigate in theory. In all research projects, you will be faced with the question about what you actually want to know, and it is important to create an actual plan. We start first with our research question or hypothesis. Next, decide your method. Do you want qualitative answers, or do you want quantitative answers? Finally, decide what type of data output you wish to capture. Is it values, categories, and/or attributes? Let's go through each of these parts in more detail. Step one is to identify your research question or hypothesis. Are you asking a question about a variable, or are you making a prediction? This decision will depend on what you already know. Step two is to determine your method. It is important to make the distinction between qualitative and quantitative data. Do you want to capture the data in words? That's qualitative data, and these are known as categories or attributes. Or do you want to capture numbers? This is called quantitative data, and these are known as values, or you may think of them as numbers. Step three, collect your data. You may collect values, categories, or attributes, or you may use a combination of any of these. In review, we can see the importance of each step of the research process, where we make decisions about inquiry, method, and data. Now let's look at an applied example of conducting research. Suppose you are interested in conducting a study about conflicts in the workplace. As a researcher, you would have several key decisions to make. Let's look at an example of a qualitative study. You might select a research question such as, in the workplace, what are the categories of conflicts that individuals engage in? Next, you will decide your method. If you elect to use qualitative data collection method, then you'll have data that is comprised of words, such as named conflict topics. This is suitable given the research question that you started with. Finally, this qualitative method would result in named categories of conflict. Overall, you can see how a researcher's decisions shape the outcome of the data. Now, depending on your research interest, you may elect to do a quantitative method. You might decide to make a prediction and therefore select a hypothesis. Here's an example. In the workplace, men will engage in more conflicts significantly more frequently than women. Next, you will need to decide your method. If you elect to use a quantitative data collection method, then you will have data that is comprised of numbers or values. This is suitable given the hypothesis that you originally stated. Finally, this quantitative method would result in data that is comprised of numbers, such as the number of times conflicts occur in a given week. As you can see, the researcher's decisions shape the outcomes of the data. Remember that your decision about the method of data collection depends on what you actually want to know as a researcher. Ultimately, you will need to decide if you are seeking answers about qualities or you are seeking answers about quantities. In some cases, you might decide that you wish to explore both aspects of a certain variable, and that is what is called using mixed methods, or the use of multiple methods of data collection in one study. But regardless of your decision, you now know the entire process of decision-making planning involved in research design. As we have seen, the research design process is relatively simple. We figure out what we know, we determine how we're going to make our inquiries about what it is that we already know, and then figure out what we predict or what we want to ask questions about, and then we collect the data. And this does seem to work very well, except for when you add humans. So what we need to talk about next is the difference between measuring something in the context of hard science versus measuring something in the context of social science. So let's make that distinction now. When we talk about the hard sciences, we're talking about topics that are easy to recognize. We think about items like astronomy, subjects like physics, subjects like biology. We tend to easily identify the hard sciences. But when we talk about social science, we want to note that usually social science involves the presence of a human. In other words, we have humans involved in that subject matter area. So we think about subject matter areas like communication studies or anthropology, possibly sociology. So we distinguish them as being two kind of different areas. And of course, they have different issues of measurement inside of them. So let's start by talking about the hard sciences. So let's say that you and I want to run some experiments. So we decide that we're going to go across campus to my laboratory. When we get there, we decide to get a pot of water and put it on the Bunsen burner. So as we put it there, we have controlled the different conditions, and we are able to see that the water does in fact boil. Now the great thing is that we can go back the next day and establish the same conditions, and we put the pot of water on the burner, and what happens? It boils again. So a couple things that we observe in the area of hard sciences is that hard science has a number of rules that govern how hard science works, and that we know we have an easier time doing something called replication. In other words, we have an easier time repeating the results when we have the same conditions or relatively similar conditions. But let's take a question around humans. Let's say I decide that I'm interested in understanding a person's boiling point. Like, what is the point that makes someone actually boil? It's an interesting question, isn't it? So I might take two romantic partners down to my laboratory, and I might control as many conditions as I can, and I might try to ask them important questions or introduce controversial topics. But the problem is that the boiling point today won't be the same boiling point tomorrow. And that's because when you introduce humans, you introduce all kinds of new complexities. So you might be saying, well, then how do we do this measurement? How do we actually measure humans in research design? And what I would say to you is we do it very carefully. And we try to control as many things as we can, but we accept the complexities and the limitations of measuring humans, knowing that they are going to introduce variables that we can't control. So what do? We do our best. So to further explore the complications in measurement, one of the ways we can do this is to talk with someone who is involved in everyday practices. So I've invited Wesley Acker from Orange County Human Relations to join us, and we'll be back in a few minutes to meet him and talk about the complexities of measurement.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Wesley Acker. He's from Orange County Human Relations, and he does restorative practices as a specialist. And so welcome to the show, Wesley.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Glad to have you here. What we wanted to talk about today were two kind of areas where I know you work, and that is in restorative practices or justice, and then also in court. And so thought we would start maybe our conversation really revolving around this concept of measurement. So the idea is when we're trying to measure something, how do we do it in those two contexts?
Yeah, it can be challenging.
Right.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the hard statistics that we can gather, those are always going to be easy. And like when we're at court, there's certain ways we measure it very clearly. When we're talking about what we do with restorative practice and restorative justice, it's really about what happens with those cases and what we can track afterwards.
Okay, so let's back up and let's talk about, I know we have this thing we call restorative justice, and then we also have restorative practices. So could you help us understand like what is the difference or similarity between those two things?
Sure. If you were talking about restorative justice, this is actually part of a justice system that allows kind of a rehabilitation of offender back into the community that they came from. It also offers a chance for potential ways to let the victim have an interaction that is potentially healing or engaging to make the situation more like it was. That's why they call it restorative justice.
Okay.
Whereas in the punitive system, they're going to be sent away for a long time, and jail time is typically what we would see.
Right.
And that means they're isolated from their community. Okay. And it's going to be difficult to reintegrate them. And it really doesn't necessarily address the needs that got them there.
Okay, so what would be a typical case like that you might see in restorative justice?
In restorative justice, you can start all the way with capital offense.
Okay.
There's ways that they can use the process to be helpful in making things move forward for all parties.
Okay.
Victim, offender, everyone. But it comes all the way down to the type of things we're doing in schools. Okay. And that means there's misbehavior, there's fights, there's reasons for detention, suspension, so forth. And what we're trying to offer are ways that we learn a little more about their situation and hopefully can create a little better outcome.
Okay, so you work specifically in the schools, is my understanding.
Right.
Okay, so tell us about your role and what you're doing now in that program.
So with the restorative practice side, what we are attempting to do is we're embedding specialists within the school system, specific to a school. We get to know the community. Okay. We give trainings for the teachers that let them start using the practice, which is certain activities that help create a community, a culture where the parties, meaning the students in this case, have a chance to be heard. Their voice is heard. If there is misbehavior, we take time to learn about what caused their choices. We find out what happened to the victims. We get to hear how it's affected others. And then we're usually able to bring them together and have a dialogue that they can make things right. Okay,
so that seems like we're addressing causes, not just effects then. What I hear ideally.
It's a process.
Okay.
There's a lot involved. It's very complex.
Okay, well, I certainly hear that.
Yeah.
A question that I have, of course, that's tied to measurement is, I guess someone funds this? Is this a government-funded program? Who funds like the type of work that you do?
Specifically with the restorative practice that we're using for schools. Currently, let's say the program we're working with has 3 full-time people embedded with Anaheim School District. So they're with 3 specific schools. I happen to be with Tustin Unified. So what we're doing there is we're spending time to actually get to know the community and provide the trainings that make the cultural change.
Okay, so
the funding, to answer your question, the funding is coming 50% from the school districts.
Oh, okay.
And then 50% coming from funding we are able to find through the agency.
Oh, okay. And so then I imagine you have to report back to them on what you did with that money. I guess the other way of asking that question is, how do you prove it's working?
Absolutely. And that's always going to be the challenge in something like this. They're going to have hard numbers, specifically the number of suspensions, detentions, the time that they have to send a student to the vice principal for some kind of disciplinary action. More importantly, we know they have those numbers, but they want to know what we are specifically doing. How many times we've made presentations to parent-teacher organizations, to staff, and how many times we may have interacted with the students directly in what we call a conference. And it means where we bring everybody together to address the harm that's done.
Okay. So you can measure, or what I heard you saying is that you measure elements of the productivity side, meaning that you do trainings, you have meetings, you have some time saved on the part of administration. You talked about that. Is that hard to measure? I mean, I kind of think, how do you know if something this deeply rooted, like embedded in changing sort of a culture, like how do you get a measurement out of that?
Right.
Like of effectiveness, you know, how do we at the end of the day say, hey, we did something here, like this is worthy of more funding?
And that is the larger question. So we're going to give those hard numbers of events, incidents, so forth. Then we have to go using some qualitative method to explore what is the experience for the parties, for the teachers. Do they feel like the environment is changing? Are they having to ask for quiet more often? We're giving them new ways to communicate with the students. We're going to ask them, do they feel like those new methods are bringing better results? Because that's happening live time right there. So it's very difficult to measure at this point.
Yeah. So is a fair measurement like how satisfied someone is with the culture?
It has to start there.
Okay.
We'll have to have what we call buy-in, and that means teachers, administrators, and the parents that are going to be involved in our trainings. If they feel like it's like it matters, it's making a difference. But the things that'll never be able to be measured are whether the student has a new way to address conflict in their life. We can't measure that for the rest of their lives, as much as we would like to. We hope that since we're working with middle schools, we hope when they get to high school, there's going to be an ongoing effect that we'll see the numbers come down in suspension, detention.
So we have the hard measurement like suspension, right, detention, these different things. Would it be a fair measurement to say they stay out of prison? Would it be a fair measurement to say they have not been convicted of a crime? Like, is that?
It's a fair measurement.
Okay.
It may not, because of the complexity, it may not indicate that we were a certain level of effectiveness when we applied the principles, the trainings, the activities.
Because time happens in that whole
and
sequence.
there's all these other influences that may come into their lives.
Right.
So there was one case where a young lady went through 5 conferences. She had to go through these whole processes, right? And it wasn't until the 5th time that she decided, man, I'm doing this to myself. So if you had measured us in 1, 2, 3, 4 times, you would say this is useless. So the buy-in is that we believe we're helping to create a healthy environment. Learning
so humans who don't want to learn the lessons easily and learn them the hard way might not be measured until later in the process.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then one of the other comments that I heard you make, which I think is really important for us to start thinking about from a measurement point, is the impact of all of the multiple variables present in this sort of thing. So when we think about this long-term change, we introduce long-term variables. So we have elements like chemical changes in the body. We have elements like maturity. We have level of education, literacy. Home
environment is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So home environment is huge because?
Because if we're talking about getting these practices to work, and they only are happening at school, yet they're spending so much more time at home or in their own neighborhood, we want to have a whole system that helps support what we're hoping to do. So the challenge right there is going to be how we're going to find out if in the home these things are actually being done on a regular basis, the new communication methods, so forth. So you can see.
Yeah, the introduction of variables is
And
huge.
the long term is the hopeful that we see over
Yeah.
time.
Now, you talked about the involvement of parents. Are these the parents of the offenders? Or are they the parents in the school that are part of the culture?
They're both.
Okay.
Yeah, as part of the process, we actually spend time, a lot of my work is prep work before we do a conference. So I take time with victim, offender, and the people they've affected. And it can be their own parents that are having a say in how they've been affected, because now they have to go down and talk to the vice principal, and they have
Okay.
all these other deals. So
Okay.
they're part of that restorative practice.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
That's going to be hard to measure.
Yeah. So as far as the feedback that you get, as far as the type of data, we talked about quantitative and qualitative data. What kind of data do you think is favored, or is one favored for one thing versus another as you report to these different agencies and school districts?
The districts, I'm sure, are going to try to look at those quantitative hard numbers up front. They really are hoping for what they call wins.
Yeah.
They're wanting to see those numbers go down. They've made the buy-in that they're going to take a year to let this process really take its effect. Nevertheless, they do want to see those hard numbers.
So is that realistic to say change in a year? Change a culture in a year? Measure it?
We're going to find out. This is the first time Anaheim has made this large of a buy-in. We've seen other school districts up Northern California, that have been very successful, and they've got the numbers to back it up.
Okay.
So we're not completely starting from scratch. Nevertheless, we know it's going to have to be tailored to
Right.
our environment.
So you said they have the numbers. So what are the numbers that they have that we don't have yet?
They've spent time on things like recitativeness,
Okay.
and again, they've had the long term to get their hard numbers. So you only get those specific students for a certain number of years. Whether you're willing and able to track them and get numbers as what they've gone on to higher education, what type
Yeah.
of jobs they have, is really difficult. It's a mountainous task.
Now, is there a way, you talked about the difficulty of long-term measurement, so I have this student who's in junior high school or middle school, and then I have them in high school and college. Could you qualitatively interview them over years
And that's what we plan
and
to do.
capture things that are important, maybe?
That's what we plan to do.
Okay.
We're hoping to build strong instruments in the qualitative side that helps us understand more quickly, we're talking months to a year, whether they see a difference for themselves. And if they don't, why? Because that's when we're able to tailor and make something work more effectively. But that's going to be on us.
Yeah, now I'm starting to rethink the question that I asked you at the beginning, which is how do you measure effectiveness? Like, when do we say it's been effective? And so I guess my question sort of launches us into maybe the difficulty of this area to say, is that a real question appropriate for this environment? In other words, can we ultimately say, okay, this is effective, yes or no? Where I hear you kind of answering me back saying yes and no.
Yeah,
And longer term, we measure qualitative, quantitative, yes and no.
Right.
And then we still have humans involved, which you
Yes.
heard me earlier talking about how humans basically
Yes.
mess up all of our measurement.
They do.
So that's kind of interesting because I'm starting to rethink my question a little bit to say, I don't know if we can say effective, not effective.
We want to say effective, non-effective, but we want to give a longer timeline than we typically would if it's truly experimental. Like if we did some type of research that is hard number.
Right.
We know quickly, repeatable. This is never going to be quite repeatable. We can keep moving it towards the truly repeatable.
Right. And something I find interesting, you made a comment about experiment. This seems to be a pretty hard area to run an experimental design.
Extremely difficult.
And what we're saying there is an experiment that would have high levels of controls. So when we run experiments, we use high levels of control to try to minimize the impact of the human essentially on the process or the presence of other variables. And so one of the questions or comments related to that is to say, could we do experimental design in RJ or restorative justice? And I would say that is going to be extremely difficult.
Well, that actually leads to something that we are doing.
Okay.
As part of our implementation. We're asking the teachers that are willing to try this. We make it voluntary. We ask the teachers to start carrying cards that guide how they're going to interact with the misbehavior.
Okay.
Technically, it's not even misbehavior, it's just some challenging situation. So the language starts becoming repeatable.
Okay.
It avoids things like trying to instantly assign blame, but it asks what happened is your first question. And then what were you thinking when it happened? The same for the victim. We ask them, how are you affected? But by using the same language repeatedly, if we can get everyone
Okay.
using the same, we can start measuring more clearly because we know what they were asked.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that this card is something that a teacher would carry.
Yes.
And then that teacher would have, it looks like there's two sides, so two different sets of questions
Correct.
depending on the situation?
For victim or offender.
Oh, okay. So those are the two sides.
Right.
And then what I hear you also saying is, just on the topic of control, is this notion that we're basically you relying on the card to make that language consistent so
Correct.
that we can kind of try to uniform the reactions, essentially, or at least not reactions, what our strategy is for collection.
Right. The impetus for the response was, and we know what question they asked. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, well, thank you for sharing about the restorative practices and restorative justice. Now I want to change topics a little bit.
Okay.
And how I know you is from mediation. So I serve as a mediator, and you do also in court. And so we won't get too specific about the courts, but we serve a number of different courts, and maybe
right.
you can tell a little bit about what those services are for Orange County Human Relations, and then also what you do.
Okay. Specifically, we cover about 5 types of courts, everything from small claims to family. And what we do there is we provide free service based on a contract that we have with the county.
Okay.
We have mediators. Most of them have been trained by us, but we know that they're credentialed somewhere. They've got a certification of some sort. And there we go through a mentoring to make sure they're keeping the standard. It's all facilitative, which means it's a voluntary type of mediation.
Okay.
And at the end of the session, we're hoping there's some kind of resolution that they've been able to both agree to.
Okay. All right. So mediation. So if I went to court, just for our viewers who haven't seen this process, if I went to court in small claims, for example, often there would be mediators available who would be able to provide this facilitative alternative.
That's correct.
Okay. And then is this paid for by the county, you said, or is that something like, is the county the court, or who's footing the bill for the services here?
So due to what's called the DERPA Act, it's the Dispute Resolution Program Act, way back in '86 is when they put this in place. There's a part of the act includes where they can get the funding to carry this out. And it's about $8 out of every person that files for a small claims suit.
Oh, they're the ones paying for it.
Correct. But it's a very small amount.
Yeah.
And what it does is it allows agencies like OC Human Relations to provide the service. It means we have staff, it means we provide trainings, it means we have an ongoing system, documentation, so forth.
Okay, so you know where I'm going next because we've already talked about measurement. Okay, so how do we measure good mediation? Like whether it was good or not good? I can say effective, not effective.
Right, and so if we're using the word effective, we say whether it came to a resolution.
Okay.
With the point of a mediation is hopefully that they do come to a resolution of their own agreement.
Okay, so when that happens, what my understanding is that those disputants would end up, the plaintiff and the defendant would end up signing a document that demonstrates or articulates that agreement they came to in mediation, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so they have this document, and so having the document is what I hear you say is the measure of effectiveness, not what's on it?
Yes. Now, there's 2 sides to that.
Okay.
Part of it is going to be qualitative and over the numbers you're hoping to see.
Okay.
If the satisfaction that they get from it is accurate. In other words, they come up with what we call a stipulation, and
Okay.
it sets the original judgment that would have been levied by the judge
Okay.
on whoever won or
Right.
lost, I should say.
Right.
That sets that aside. And the agreement is what's in place.
Right.
So no judgment, but guess what? If both parties don't follow through,
Right.
it can be turned to a judgment.
Yeah.
So those hard numbers are how many cases came through, how
Okay.
many went to mediation,
Okay.
how many came to a resolution, and got the stipulation signed.
Okay, so those are all quantitative.
Very quantitative.
So I can say there's this many cases, this percentage went to mediation, this number have stipulations, this many defaulted
Yep.
and ended up with judgments
And
or
the
whatever.
demographics that go along with all those participants.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know some demographics that you would share here, or is it just too complicated to kind of sweepingly say?
It depends on year.
Yeah.
We've seen, but typically about between 70 to 80% of those that try mediation end up with the stipulation. It varies, but it feels like a pretty good success.
Yeah, it's a pretty
level.
high number.
Yeah.
So then, would we also know the number of how long the average court case, trial takes? And then could we make that association and say, hey, 80% times these minutes are saving the court X amount of hours per week, per day, per month?
Right. They've actually, under the DERPA Act, they've been able to do that over
Mm-hmm.
time. We don't currently do that anymore. What we do is just keep our own records and then send those to the county.
Mm-hmm.
They keep track of those stats.
Okay, so
But the interesting stat is how many of those stipulations get returned back for
Yeah.
the judgment, which of course
Yeah.
they're allowed to do.
right, yeah, that's pretty interesting too.
Yeah.
And so we could count that. Okay. So what are some measurements that we could do in mediation that are qualitative then?
It's the satisfaction level.
Okay.
So at the end of the process, we always give both litigants a survey, and it's asking them how they felt they were treated by the mediator, whether they thought the mediation process was useful to them, would they recommend it, do they feel like it addressed the issues that were on the table. And so that's very qualitative. It's like a Likert scale of 1 to 5 or something.
Well,
like
it ends
that.
up being quantitative from Likert, but yeah.
Exactly. We're
Right.
trying to bring that
Right.
back.
You can
We
put
allow-
it on measurements.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. We allow them to give their own reflection.
Yeah,
right?
and,
We give them
write
space.
some words there too. So, that's interesting. So whether they're satisfied. So one of the things that occurs to me is I go to small claims. I have a problem with my neighbor or something. I'm in small claims and I'm working this out. Would we ever have people that are that satisfied? I mean, they had an unsatisfying experience to manage. Right? Is it kind of a funny variable to measure in the sense that you're here because you're unsatisfied? Hey, how satisfied are you? Like, can you get someone from one place to the other?
Well, there's that human condition we all bring into it, our own little propensity to create what we believed, our perceptions of things.
Yeah.
And then we're faced with the realities, and we realize that this actually could be quite satisfying because they may have been suing for $6,000 or something. And what we found over the discussions, it was really different for X and X and X reasons. So now they walk away with an agreement they actually feel quite good about, potentially.
So it's possible to get all the way from I have this conflict
Yes.
that is terribly unsatisfying to I have a level of satisfaction.
Absolutely.
It's just an interesting variable to me. I don't know if there's a way to track it in the middle. Probably not, because in mediation we're in that live interaction, so it moves, so
Exactly.
to speak, but it's a pretty interesting variable. What are some things you think we can't measure in court settings?
Stress level.
Okay.
Yeah, the ability to, or the sense that one or the other participants feel like they're truly being heard and all things are being addressed. They have that opportunity while we're mediating, hopefully, but we're not set up to accurately verify, were you heard there?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
impossible. And if we could
Yeah.
understand stress level even,
Yeah.
if we had little electrodes hooked up to them, we could get some kind of quantitative data about how they were experiencing it.
Yeah, or even ask them, but then you interrupt the whole process, right?
Right.
So how stressed are you? I think I've seen every kind of outcome in that category of people more stressed after mediation, less stressed, entirely relieved.
Right.
I mean, it could be anything. Usually less stressed after having that conversation.
Even just to have the thing done.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, and then I want to ask you a couple questions about family, which I know you do.
Uh-huh.
And so that just seems like a difficult measurement area to figure out effectiveness when we're talking about things like child custody or divorce agreements. What are your comments on measuring those kinds of variables in family?
The real difficulty is we don't know where they're coming from. Because if we could get a baseline equivalent of how much difficulty they're having in resolving a custody issue and how long it's been that they've been working at. So we do know when they filed divorce, and we know when they've had certain points of settlement, because those are all part of the court record.
Right.
But
And
we
you
don't,
have that as a mediator. You have the record.
correct.
Okay.
But we're not able to say, was that smooth?
Yeah.
Was mediation better than this before? So again, we're asking them to give us qualitative responses at the end,
Okay.
both on a scale of satisfaction, and they're also able to put specifically their own thoughts.
Well, it kind of resembles what we talked about a minute ago with small claims, but
Yes.
it's on a higher, more emotional level
really
to say,
is.
I had a terribly unsatisfying set of conflicts, and then now I'm going to ask you, how'd you feel about mediating these conflicts?
Right.
And
Right.
we have the
And-
same emotional outcomes.
And sometimes, even though they have a reasonable resolution, they've negotiated their way to that rather than actually collaborated
Oh, right.
and come up with the relationship
Yeah.
that can go on.
Right.
And if they're just frustrated and they have to agree today, how can we really measure
So, yeah,
the
that's
satisfaction?
That's pretty interesting because you're commenting on, there's probably levels of quality that exist there in terms of outcomes in family mediation.
Exactly.
And so you have maybe some influence of how the participant maybe would act or participants, and then that affects, of course, that outcome,
And
which
if
is
they're-
pretty interesting.
And if they're struggling with how they're going to resolve not custody so much, let's say financial issues, division of assets, and one of them just lost their job. So they're really going to be pushing and driving during that mediation, and it's going to be almost impossible for them to say, was this really effective for you?
Right.
Because they felt like I needed to get what I needed to get.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
a lot of times
Interesting.
conflict is how we perceive it
Yeah.
because of our certain circumstance. And how do you measure a lifetime of perception?
I don't know.
Difficult.
Yeah, very difficult.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the
You're
show to talk about measurement. And I think some things that I've learned is how crucial context is for this conversation.
Absolutely.
Because as we're talking about it, we have context impacting almost every type of measurement you and I have talked about here. To say whether it's the context of the relationship or how the court runs or what the funding sources are, all of that adds up to this complicated area where we have to kind of make decisions and do our best. You heard me say this about
Right.
measuring humans. Do our best to try to figure out what we can know,
Right.
and then ultimately try to benefit others with it.
Right. And our hope is that we're always going to be able to create the best instruments to try to start seeing those patterns and then make our adjustments
Yeah.
as we go forward, especially with the restorative practices.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Good to be here.
Appreciate your input. We'll be back in a few minutes to talk further about big data and what do we do with it.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
So as we've seen from our conversation with Wesley, a central question really that we have to answer is what do we know and then what do we want to know? But we also saw how important context is. Now, one side note that I want to talk about here is this tendency for you and I to favor qualitative or quantitative, one or the other. Like you might be sitting here saying, well, I don't really understand quantitative, so I want to give qualitative responses. Or perhaps you understand quantitative and you don't want to get into the words. What I would tell you is I don't think that our training on what we prefer should impact the research we do. In other words, we've seen the crucial nature of context and the difficulty in measuring humans And so our decision making has to be basically around the notion of what are we facing? What is it that we're looking at? And then ultimately, what would be the best way to answer that question? Now, of course, we talked about some of the difficulties in grabbing numbers, and we talked about some of the difficulties in grabbing words or even measuring things over time. Of course, there will be difficulties. But I guess my ultimate point here is to say, I think it would be easy for us to say, I don't do quantitative methods, or I don't do qualitative methods. And the answer is, we really need to do all of it, because it depends on the question we're trying to answer. So one of the last sections of this program is for us to really talk about why we do measurement at all. You heard us talk about the concept of effectiveness. You heard us talk about this idea that we need to measure things to get funding. The question is, why do we measure things? So, I mean, we could say, I measure things to make myself feel better. We could say I measure things to get funding or to save my job. But ultimately, I would put this idea forth. And that is that you and I actually measure things to help the human condition. Now that seems kind of lofty, right? We do things to measure to help the human condition. But ultimately, I think that is a safe place to land. And the reason I say that is that when we talk about the restorative practices, when we talk about court mediation, ultimately the measurement and our effectiveness and all those questions around it have to do with what we end up with. And if we're measuring just for the sake of measurement, I'm not sure we get very far. So one example that we can look at is a researcher named Max Little. And Max Little is a math consultant. Now you might immediately say, oh no, a math consultant. But what I want us to do is take a look at this clip where Max explains in his TED Talk his contribution to helping individuals with Parkinson's. Let's take a look.
So, well, I do applied math, and this is a peculiar problem for anyone who does applied math, is that we are like management consultants. No one knows what the hell we do. So I'm going to give you some attempt today to try and explain to you what I do. So, dancing is one of the most human of activities. We delight at ballet virtuosos and tap dancers, you will see later on. Now, ballet requires an extraordinary level of expertise and a high level of skill, and probably a level of initial suitability that may well have a genetic component to it. Now, sadly, neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease gradually destroy this extraordinary ability, as it is doing to my friend Jan Stripling, who was a virtuoso ballet dancer in his time. So great progress in treatment has been made over the years. However, there are 6.3 million people worldwide who have the disease, and they have to live with incurable weakness, tremor, rigidity, and the other symptoms that go along with the disease. So what we need are objective tools to detect the disease before it's too late. We need to be able to measure progression objectively. And ultimately, the only way we're going to know when we actually have a cure is when we have an objective measure that can answer that for sure. But frustratingly, with Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders, there are no biomarkers. So there's no simple blood tests that you can do. And the best that we have is like this 20-minute neurologist test. You have to go to the clinic to do it. It's very, very costly. And that means that outside of clinical trials, it's just never done. It's never done. But what if patients could do this test at home? Now that would actually save on a difficult trip to the clinic. And what if patients could do that test themselves, right? No expensive staff time required. It takes about $300, by the way, in the neurologist clinic to do it. So what I want to propose to you as an unconventional way in which we can try to achieve this, because you see, in one sense at least, we are all virtuosos like my friend Jan Stripling. So here we have a video of the vibrating vocal folds. Now, this is healthy, and this is somebody making speech sounds, and we can think of ourselves as vocal ballet dancers because we have to coordinate all of these vocal organs when we make sounds. And we all actually have the genes for it, FOXP2, for example. And like ballet, it takes an extraordinary level of training. I mean, just think how long it takes a child to learn to speak. And from the sound, we can actually track the vocal fold position as it vibrates. And just as the limbs are affected in Parkinson's, so too are the vocal organs. So in the bottom trace, you can see an example of irregular vocal fold tremor. We see all the same symptoms. We see vocal tremor, weakness, and rigidity. The speech actually becomes quieter and more breathy after a while, and that's one of the example symptoms of it. So these vocal effects can actually be quite subtle in some cases, But with any digital microphone and using precision voice analysis software in combination with the latest in machine learning, which is very advanced by now, we can now quantify exactly where somebody lies on the continuum between health and disease using voice signals alone. So these voice-based tests, how do they stack up against expert clinical tests? Well, they're both non-invasive. The neurologist test is non-invasive. They both use existing infrastructure. You don't have to design a whole new set of hospitals to do it. And they're both accurate, okay. But in addition, voice-based tests are non-expert. That means they can be self-administered. They're high speed, take about 30 seconds at the most. They're ultra-low cost. And we all know what happens. When something becomes ultra-low cost, it becomes massively scalable. And so, here are some amazing goals that I think we can deal with now. We can reduce logistical difficulties for patients. No need to go to the clinic for a routine checkup. We can do high-frequency monitoring to get objective data. We can perform low-cost mass recruitment for clinical trials, and we can make population-scale screening feasible for the first time. We have the opportunity to start to search for the early biomarkers of disease before it's too late. So, taking the first steps towards this, today we're launching the Parkinson's Voice Initiative. With Aculab and patients like me, we're aiming to record a very large number of voices worldwide to collect enough data to start to tackle these 4 goals. We have local numbers accessible to 750 million people on the planet. Anyone healthy or with Parkinson's can call in cheaply and leave recordings, a few cents each. And I'm really happy to announce that we've already hit 6% of our target just in 8 hours. Thank you.
As we see from Max Little's contributions, here he used actual measurement tools to help the human condition. Now, what I find inspiring is it isn't just helping a little. We know that the traditional test for Parkinson's is hundreds of dollars, and those patients have to go to the clinic, which may or may not be additional cost. So now we have cut that cost maybe by 90% and made it far more accessible around the world. Max's contribution is amazing mathematics. But it's not about the math. So it might be tempting to get caught up in the math. I mean, think about the equations that he had to go through to figure out this puzzle. But if we were to only think about the math, we would miss the contribution. This is about helping others. So it's not really about the math. One example that I like to use is when we talk about musicians, we can think about how musicians use music, but they really use notes. And so if I went up to a musician and started engaging them in a big conversation about notes, it would be a little bit funny to get focused on the notes and not really talk about the music. And that's the same idea in quantitative methods, that to get overly focused on the numbers would be to kind of miss the whole picture. In other words, to miss the overarching theme of what we're really engaging in. And so as we think about Max's contribution, it's really not about the math, even though he's a math consultant. It's about helping individuals have a better life. As we start to answer some of the questions about research measurement, of course, one of the things that we have to observe immediately is that you and I live in a very big data-driven world. What does that mean? Our phones collect where our cars are located. We have data on when we log on to the internet. There is consumer data collected about the things that we purchase. There's weather. There's all these measurements taking place all the time. And in fact, we have so much data that we have collected that it demands actually a new level of critical thinking on the part of the consumer and the researcher. And so as we're evaluating that, one of our key tasks is to say, what do we do with the data? And ultimately, what do the data mean and what do the data not mean? So to help us think about this idea, I want to have us watch a clip from Susan Ettlinger. And this clip is from a TED Talk that she did called, What Do We Do With All This Big Data? Let's take a look.
At this point, you might be thinking, okay, Susan, we get it. You can take data, you can make it mean anything. And this is true. It's absolutely true. But the challenge is that we have this opportunity to try to make meaning out of it ourselves. Because frankly, data doesn't create meaning. We do. So, as business people, as consumers, as patients, as citizens, we have a responsibility, I think, to spend more time focusing on our critical thinking skills. Why? Because at this point in our history, as we've heard many times over, we can process exabytes of data at lightning speed. And we have the potential to make bad decisions far more quickly, efficiently, and with far greater impact than we did in the past. Great, right? And so what we need to do instead is spend a little bit more time on things like the humanities and sociology and the social sciences, rhetoric, philosophy, ethics, because they give us context that is so important for big data and because they help us become better critical thinkers. Because after all, if I can spot a problem in an argument, it doesn't much matter whether it's expressed in words or in numbers. And this means teaching ourselves to find those confirmation biases and false correlations and being able to spot a naked emotional appeal from 30 yards. Because something that happens after something doesn't mean it happened because of it necessarily. And if you let me geek out on you for a second, the Romans called this post hoc, ergo propter hoc, after which, therefore because of which. And it means questioning disciplines like demographics. Why? Because they're based on assumptions about who we all are based on our gender and our age and where we live, as opposed to data on what we actually think and do. And since we have this data, we need to treat it with appropriate privacy controls and consumer opt-in. And beyond that, we need to be clear about our hypotheses, the methodologies that we use, and our confidence in the result. As my high school algebra teacher used to say, show your math. Because if I don't know what steps you took, I don't know what steps you didn't take. And if I don't know what questions you asked, I don't know what questions you didn't ask. And it means asking ourselves really the hardest question of all. Did the data really show us this? Or does the result make us feel more successful and more...
As we saw from Susan Ettlinger, it's important for us to have three main guideposts as we examine big data. We have to engage in critical thinking, we have to pay attention to context, and we have to engage in good decision making. It's not simply about having all kinds of sets of numbers. It's about what you do with it. So today in our session, we've gone over a few main areas. One is we talked about the basics of data measurement. There we identified qualitative and quantitative approaches. We also talked about why we measure things. And we looked at the ideas that we have to make decisions. We have to pay attention to context. We understand the complexity of involving humans in it. And then finally, we talked about what we do with the results. And we saw two great examples of what Max Little talks about and his contribution to Parkinson's, and then also what Susan Ettlinger talks about, our great caution as we interpret these data. So collectively, we've had kind of an overview of this class 507 and the idea that we can design, research, and interpret it very carefully. So as we sign off from this program today, this is Dr. Pamela Kreiser, hoping that your day is different, but also significantly different.